discussion. I liked reading this paper very much. I think the question of what's been going on in services in India is an important one, mainly because India just stands in dramatic contrast with all the other sort of success stories that we have of economic development in recent times. And I think in particular, India stands out because almost all the other successful Asian economies are based on export-led economic growth. At times, people might allege that it was export surplus-led economic growth, but usually economic export growth. Sometimes referred to as a flying geese model in the sense that what was done in Japan after World War II seemed to have been done by successive rounds of Asian economies. But that is simply not the model that at all fits India. I think that has become very clear in the analysis over the last decade. And the major difference is that there's just this very large role for services growth. And the other thing about the services is it really doesn't seem to be that dependent on growth in trade. There's one exception, I think, with some of the IT work with countries like the United States. But that's not the key to the services. When you look at a lot of the other industries and the other applications, services is growing rapidly in India for reasons beyond just export to industrial countries. But the other puzzle about it is it just doesn't make a lot of sense in terms of comparative advantage. It's very difficult to explain. This is a country, as was mentioned this morning, is extraordinarily uneducated, very high levels of illiteracy, and what's its comparative advantage? Highly unskilled labor. Where does it do well? Skilled, relatively skilled services, and surprisingly, in fact, it goes further. You could say relatively skilled manufacturing. It's the higher levels of the manufacturing distribution. So why is it that India seems to have this funny mix, a contrast to what a lot of economists would have anticipated, I think, if they had never seen the data. And so what this paper is trying to address is a topic that's come up very frequently, which is why services? And people have tried to explain this, as the authors mentioned, by maybe it's due to trade liberalization, but if trade liberalization affected things, it should have the biggest effect on manufacturing goods. And so you usually end up with very convoluted arguments about how somehow it could have worked in services in a more indirect fashion. There could be an indirect income effect, which is mentioned in this paper as well, that the growth in services is somehow tied to growth in manufacturing. It is true that India manufacturing has done better than a lot of people think. It just hasn't done well in exporting. It's done well in improving its efficiencies in some respect to service the domestic market. The third one that was mentioned in the paper is there is improved access of capital, to capital in the global market, and a lot of these services, like computer services, do require very high quality capital, and maybe that was the driving force behind their development. But the real problem that just frustrated all this discussion is there are no data on services. Services is always the orphan in almost every national statistical system where everybody's always biased in favor of collecting data on goods production, not services. In the Indian economic accounts, services is largely estimated by a very indirect method. You get the distribution of workers, and then you assign to each worker a value added per worker, and then you aggregate up. It's kind of a clever means of doing it, but it's not a direct measure. There's no information in the national accounts on employment, and in fact, there's no information on employment at the level of total India, except in the quinquennial surveys, which are the basis for the national accounts revisions every 5 years. Well, yeah, much of the data that we actually work with is to a large extent interpolated between these quinquennial base years to try to get up to levels for the national accounts. Services get shortchanged is the argument in much of this. Well, the alternative that this paper brings out, and I think is just an excellent idea, is that they point out there were two India-wide surveys that focused on service industry enterprises, one in 2001 and 2, and one in 2006 and 7. And it has all of services, excluding retail trade, which was covered in the earlier paper, and excluding finance. And this is really, when you look at the survey results, an extremely interesting set of data, because this is individual enterprises. They collected data on sales, employment, their capital assets, and their purchased materials. That's a lot of information to get on service industries. Even if you were in the United States, you'd almost never have access to such information. That means that they can construct measures of value added and various concepts of productivity. And I think the most critical thing to keep in mind is that this is a data set where all the information on the inputs is coming from exactly the same source as the information on the outputs. Most of the time, we're matching up two independent surveys. We have no idea whether they agree and how they classified the companies or not. But in this case, that's not true. There are three basic sections to the paper. The first one, I think, is just a very nice introduction to the paper. It does a very good job of laying out what are the issues about trying to explain why it is that services may be such a big role. The second part tries to use the survey to look at some industry and state averages. So it's just taking them as cross-sectional surveys, computes industry averages, and looks at that data. And then the third part of the paper is an effort to analyze the change between the two survey years. It's basically, and most of it, based on a regression analysis at the micro level. It's very important to keep in mind that these are not matched panels. This is not the same firm that can ever be matched up. And therefore, any attempt to do so is somewhat synthetic. You're just trying to say the industry average in one year compared to the industry average in the other. And for some reasons we'll get to, the surveys may not really be compatible. That may have affected it. Let me just say a few things about the industry and state averages, which were discussed earlier, so I'm going to skip most of it. I think this was a very strength of the paper, that you could use this to calculate these productivity measures. I would just argue that the paper could do a lot more of this. This is a very interesting set of data. Just do the cross-section. I would have liked to have seen a lot more about labor productivity by industry and by size and by state, all separate together. It's a big survey, so you can separate it out. The moment you look at productivity by state, you worry about the meaning, because the distribution of the industries across states is really quite different. So it's the ability to control for these things all at the same time. And as was mentioned, well, in the discussion, there's also big issues about economies of scale. And can you use this data to explore more fully economies of scale in the service sector? How important are they? Because, as was mentioned, 90% of the firms are just own account operations. And you just cannot do this type of analysis with any other data source in India that I know of. So I think this paper deserves to be congratulated by doing something that hasn't been done before. And I think more of this sort of work will be done in the future, now that they've illustrated the usefulness of the surveys. The one problem I want to mention did come up in the discussion, and that is that the second survey contains two surveys which you try to put together, two frames, if you like. One of them is a list survey. In general, I think it's an excellent idea. If you just try to use an area survey, you're not going to find enough big firms, because you're doing like 5 firms in each little sampling area. Most of the time, you're just going to get a bunch of small firms. They all look alike. You end up oversampling the small firms, and you don't have enough information about the big firms. So you try to make up a list sample of large firms. We do that in the United States a lot. We did it, for example, with rich people. If you try to do a survey of people and ask how wealthy you are, you just end up with a lot of poor people. You want rich people to learn something. And so this did this. There's a problem, though, and that is that they got a list of 1,000 firms, supposed to be big firms. It came mainly from the Bank of India, but also from an industry, I think, Commerce Department inside India. And the problem with it was that they couldn't find half the firms. Not that the firms refused, but they couldn't find them. Now, if these are really the biggest firms in India, you'd think that they would exist. And it's a little troubling that the government gave them this list, and so many of them they couldn't find for various reasons, or they'd already gone out of business. So I don't think it was a very good list. And so you ended up with 270 firms that you tried to include in the sample. If by accident one of them did get surveyed in the area sample, you excluded them so you didn't double count them. But that didn't happen very often when you only have 270 firms. When you have this, it's a real problem statistically to figure out how to merge these two samples together. There are methods to do it, but they're not very reliable, and everybody's always had questions about how do you know that what weights to attach to the different observations. And I think that could potentially be, as was mentioned by the authors, a problem here. That in fact, the second survey is just not like the first survey. What I would suggest as a way to try to deal with that a little bit was what was done by the NSSO when they published the data originally, and that is that they recomputed some of the things for the second survey, leaving out the list. And so they could compare an area sample from the first round to an area sample of the second round, and that gives you some measure of the bias. Second, I would have liked to see in it, let's have a comparison to the national accounts. We want to make sure that a survey is reporting the same story as we see in the national accounts. If it's not, we'd like to know that it doesn't. But we'd like to think, hypothetically, that the national accounts is right, and now I'm going out and I'm getting a survey that's giving me more detail about it. And if we at least check that to see whether or not it's true, it would be useful information about the reliability of the survey. As we mentioned in the case of India, I don't have great confidence in the national accounts estimate either, so maybe you'd argue both ways, but still it'd be very useful to do. So I think there are more ways to check the quality of the data and elaborate on it than was done in the paper, and I think this is a source of several more papers that the authors could do. I don't think you should put it all in one. Let me just turn them ending to talk about the last one. What they're trying to do here and report on is compute the change in total factor of productivity by estimating a production function. Actually at the level of the individual firms at one point in time, and then including on the right-hand side some variables like what state are you in, what industry are you in, and most particular, what survey were you in? Thinking that the dummy variable for the second survey gives a measure of growth. As I can tell, they ended up with about 578 groups that they were trying to control for on the right-hand side, but thousands of observations on the left-hand side. But if you don't have a lot of individual firm variation variables on the right-hand side, you're not accomplishing anything. You might just as well aggregate up. It's just averages. So it's not clear to me what was the advantage of the micro estimation, particularly at this point where I'm still trying to learn, what does this data look like? How reasonable is it? I would have liked to have just seen the simple thing, do the industry state averages in the 2 years, compare them, look and see how they turn out. Because the results at the very end do not seem to me in that figure to be very plausible. And I base that on, when you do it, it turns out that the role of TFP shrinks as the firm grows faster. And that doesn't seem to me too credible. I normally think of industries that are very rapidly growing, they're going to have a lot of TFP growth, not a very little share of TFP growth. And so I think we just don't understand why the results turned out the way they did. And it would be better to build up more gradually by doing a lot of the intermediate steps just so we could check the quality of the data. Therefore, I do not yet have a lot of confidence in the conclusions of the paper about why services did well in India. But I applaud the authors because this is potentially a fantastically good source of information to explore the behavior of the service sector in much more detail in India than had been done before. The part they do, I think, suggests that it's a very good survey. They may not match exactly between the 2 years, but the quality of each of the individual surveys seems to be high and very fruitful to explore in more detail the nature of the service firms in India. Thank you very much.